Everyone. Good morning. So just for our guests who may not know, so welcome to all of you. It's good to have you. Those of you who are not regulars here, if you don't know me, my name is Greg Bonfilio, and I work here at St. Ignatius, pastor. We're really grateful, just in case. Thank you. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. I am a great admirer of all things NCR, so we're just really thrilled to have the three folks from the National Catholic Reporter with us. You've heard me say before that I think it's one of the most important voices in the U.S. Catholic Church today. I mean, I think one could credibly argue that it's the most important voice in the Catholic Church today. I should disclaim that I am a subscriber, I'm a faithful reader, and I'm a donor. So the NCR, the NCR, I think, as you know, it's known for its journalistic integrity, that it never feared to shine a light wherever there is darkness, and that's the right, the left, the center, everywhere. The NCR was among the first to report on the sex abuse crisis and trying to call bishops to accountability, among the first to speak out against the investigation of women religious a decade ago. Often enough, I'll read an article that opens a window and gives me an insight or a bit of understanding that falls into a category that in my mind is called, I wish I didn't know that because now I have to do something. Chris White and Michael Sean Winters are some of the columns that I read faithfully, and Brian Frog, many, and to glean insights and perspective on issues in our church. I use their stuff frequently in my talks and homilies. I use Sister Mary McGlone, her Reflections for the Sunday Gospel, and Pat Marin. If you attend our daily Mass, you will hear his words frequently out of my mouth. And it's fair to say that the NCR factors big into my life as a contemporary Catholic. So I want to give them as much time. So I want to introduce Joe Ferrulo, the CEO and publisher of the NCR. He served on the board of directors of the publication since 2018. He was previously an executive vice president of programming at CBS, overseeing several long-running shows, developing new programs, and helping guide his division's transition to digital media, not an easy thing. Before his time at CBS, Joe worked as a journalist. He was senior level producer at NBC News for Dateline NBC. He won an Emmy Award as part of the NBC team covering the events of 9/11, and another Emmy nomination for his story about the children of Amer Asian Vietnam War refugees. In my mind, his greatest credential is, however, that he graduated from Fordham Prep, the Jesuit high school in the Bronx. Joe also attended Columbia. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Sylvia Lopez, and their two grown daughters. Please welcome Joe Ferrulo.
That covers everything I was going to say. Thank you. Could you go on longer? My God. So I say to Chris White, leave dreary, rainy Rome, and why don't you come to California for a little sunshine? Not so much. I'm so sorry. 10 years ago, and a few weeks, as the conclave was forming in Rome, a Catholic writer, Paul Bowman, wrote in Commonweal that he hoped the cardinals would select a pope who was a little bit Californian. And by that he meant someone who was a little more open, a little more welcoming, and maybe a little less judgmental. And I think he got what he asked for in Francis. And as the LA Times wrote today, when you call anything Californian these days, you're in for a fight from one end of it or the other. And I think Francis is in for that too. I think what Chris is going to address and what we're going to talk about is the church entering a hinge moment, one of many in its very long history, in the 2 years ahead. There's a synod coming in October, another one in the October after that. And what happens in that time, and what we are handed with at the end of that time, I think will court the direction of the church for decades to come. Will it be more Californian? That would be great. Or will it be smaller and a little more pure? That's what's at stake. No one has a better view into what may happen than Chris White. Chris covers the Vatican for us. And am I embarrassing you? That's great. That's great. Gosh. Chris, I want to say he has a front row seat, but he doesn't just sit. He goes out and he reports. And he covers the Vatican the way a good political reporter would cover Capitol Hill or the White House. What are the politics and personalities behind the decisions being made? Why are some things in favor and some things not? And who's behind that? And where's the money? Follow the money. And that's what Chris does a spectacular job at. The other thing he's really good at is an observer of human nature, which if you've met many bishops and cardinals, that's a good thing to have. Because it turns out they're humans just like the rest of us. So if you can figure them out and figure out where they're coming from, you can find out a lot about where the church may be going. Let me introduce Chris formally, our Vatican correspondent. He has also written for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, not as influential as the National Catholic Reporter, granted. Nonetheless, apparently good newspapers. You will hear him tomorrow morning on NPR talking about Francis at 10. He will be getting up at 3 o'clock to do that, about 3 o'clock in the morning. So if he doesn't make much sense, please don't hold that against him. He is also the main Vatican analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Chris has a master's in ethics and society from Fordham and is a graduate of King's College with his bachelor's. And honestly, one of the finest reporters covering one of the most important beats in the world. Chris.
Just trying to unlock my iPad here. It's great to be in San Francisco, which is really one of my favorite cities. And I think this is one of the most dynamic parishes in the country. So it's an honor to be here. And huge plaudits to Father Greg, who I understand is just really the lifeblood of this place. So I really appreciate the invitation. It's an interesting thing. We've all been, all of us on the Vatican beat have been taking stock of the Francis papacy on this anniversary. And so what I thought I'd do is to sort of serve as a table setter of the conversation, is take you through 10 images that I think capture some of the major themes and moments, and I think that will kind of set us up for a nice conversation after the break. And I want us to go back to 10 years ago. It was a rainy day in St. Peter's Square. There was a seagull sitting on top of the chimney of the Sistine Chapel that was getting almost more of the attention than the actual voting that was taking place inside. And then out of nowhere, much more sooner than had been expected, a figure comes out on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. And I want us just to go back to that first moment. If Laura could help me out here with the first slide. This is the first image. And I'm going to make this a bit interactive for a moment here. What were some of your thoughts? I'd just like a few hands to say, what came to mind when you saw this image? A Jesuit, yes. This guy's cool, yeah? Humble, yeah. Simple, yeah, so I think that's one of the most striking things here. We see him just wearing the simple white cassock. He had shunned the red velvet mozzetta, the gold pectoral cross, and then he, after a simple greeting, the buonasera, the good evening, he had just a few very simple pleasantries. He introduced himself as the Bishop of Rome, and it was clear, as one of the archbishops said to me recently, that this wasn't just showbiz, that something very different was happening in this moment. Because he did something very unexpected, and I think you can see it in this image here. He bows and asks for the people to bless and pray for him. It was a sign that things in Rome were going to be different. We didn't know what the next 10 years would hold, but I think it was very evident that something new, the ground was shifting. And I think it's also been a sign to buckle up because there was a wild ride ahead. And so in the next image, Laurie, if you'll help me out here, we see an image from Holy Thursday. And this was the image that I think shocked a lot of people because in many respects, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise at 2013 to see a pope washing the feet of women. But here he is at a prison washing the feet of women, and the headlines the next day were that the pope had broken church law. So I think you see this image here, and this is the image from 2015. I like it because I like the exchange that's happening, but he did the same thing in 2013, as he had done as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires for years beforehand. And we see him washing the feet of women, and I think it's a beautiful sign of who he is, but I also think we can look at this picture to sort of, in a sense, cement the beginning of the resistance to Pope Francis. Because if we look at those headlines the next day that the Pope had broken church law, we saw a glimpse of the legalism that Father Greg spoke about this morning, that we've seen, in a sense, come back over and over again over the last 10 years from his critics, for those who aren't on board with his pastoral agenda. So, next photo. This is a photo that I love. It's perhaps not nearly as famous, but it's from July of 2013. This was the first time the Pope left Rome, and he went to Lampedusa, a tiny, tiny little island off the coast of Italy. And the Pope made it his first trip after reading about the horrible, horrible shipwreck there, where over 100 immigrants had lost their lives. They were traveling from North Africa trying to reach Europe. And on this occasion, he took that wreath and tossed it into the Mediterranean, and he blasted the global indifference of those that wanted to look away rather than confront what was happening in their own backyard. I think in many respects, you could say this is where the papacy began. It's sort of where he cemented migration as one of his most central themes. It's also the first time we heard him use the language of a throwaway culture. It was a rebranding of a way to talk about life issues. It wasn't just about abortion or just about the death penalty, but you had to see everything as interconnected, and hence his new language of a throwaway culture. Laurie? Bravo to Laurie. This is the photo that did go viral. It's a very poignant photo from his first year in office. And this was at a Wednesday general audience. I'm sure many of you have had the pleasure to go to a Wednesday general audience in Rome, where the Pope makes his way around, St. Peter's Square. We get some great images of the Pope, often kissing babies, and those are the images that we expect. But this was an image that was unexpected. It's the Pope taking a man who had a severe skin condition. He was an Italian, I believe he was about 53 years old, and taking him and caressing him. Sort of what the world rejects, the Pope was holding close to him. And after that, the Pope said, this is the example of the church that he wants us to be, those unafraid to go out and hold those that are suffering and those that are rejected by the world. And this individual that we see here afterwards said that being in the Pope's caress was like a moment in paradise for him. I think we see in this image so much of who Francis is, this desire to encounter the other, and especially to go beyond those that are often sort of on the front row seats of society to those that are cast away, the sick, the suffering, and to hold them close, and for the church to hold them close as well. This image is a bit closer to home. It's not in Rome. It's here in Washington in September 2015, and this is when Pope Francis became the first pope to address the U.S. Congress. It's a remarkable image. You see Pope Francis sitting there. The Pope does not really speak English. He understands it better than he'd like you to think. But he had practiced English for a while leading up to this. He'd had a private tutor. And I was told he was quite nervous, actually, about this moment, having to speak in English for what was about an hour and 20 minutes. And at this moment, he looked sort of at the lives of 4 Americans, Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Martin Luther King Jr., to say this is the example of what it looks like to be a great American. You don't have to be Catholic to recognize the sort of heroic virtues of these individuals, but this is your country at its best, and don't lose sight of this. I think so many people were shocked that this moment ever happened, that a very divided U.S. Congress could invite the Pope and really rally around him. You had behind Pope Francis here, you can't see it in this photo, but you had then Speaker of the House John Boehner, who didn't stop crying for an hour and 20 minutes. And then you had then Vice President Joe Biden seated next to him. I think it was a rare moment both in the country's political life and in church life. And I think, as an American, who sometimes we all encounter these moments where it's sometimes tough to be proud of your country. This is a great moment for us as Americans and Catholics to look to. And a moment that really, for to have a pope to address U.S. Congress was something, just not so long ago, many thought would be impossible. But Pope Francis was able to do just that. So I get a 2-for-1 here. I was trying to take 10 photos for 10 years, but this one I squeezed 2 into 1. These are individuals that many of us here in the United States may not recognize. The one on my right is the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which is considered the highest institution of learning in Egypt and in Sunni Islam. Pope Francis's embrace of him here went viral. The image was on billboards all throughout the Middle East. They've had over a dozen private meetings, and in a sense have kind of taken their show on the road. They've traveled to Kazakhstan together. They've gone to Abu Dhabi together. And then their first meeting was in Cairo, of course. And over lunch one day at the Vatican, the two of them were sitting around talking about what they could do together. And they said, we need a strong statement from religious leaders, particularly the head of Catholicism and the head of the Sunni Muslim world, to say religion cannot be used for violence. And so over the course of about 6 months, and very quietly, only a very small sort of kitchen cabinet of people knew that this was happening, they drafted this document known as the Document of Human Fraternity that they then signed together in 2019 in Abu Dhabi. This document has gone on to sort of become part of the curriculums of so many schools in the Middle East. I think it's one of the great success stories that's been underreported in this papacy, that this Pope has changed the Church's relationship with the Muslim world. But he didn't just stop at Sunni Islam, he also extended a hand to Shiites. And so this photo here is in Iraq when he took his very brave voyage to Iraq in March 2021, I believe, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when so many people had been staying at home. Just when the vaccines were rolling out, Pope Francis got his 2 jabs, and he got on a plane. And he went to one of the most sort of trepidatious places that a pope could go, to Iraq, becoming the first pope to do so. And half the time was spent sort of building up the beleaguered small Christian minority population. But he also extended a hand to the Shiite Muslim world, which has, in a sense, been much more fractured than the Sunni world. And this meeting here of these two religious leaders captures Pope Francis, I think, sort of extended peripheral vision, this constant sense to look beyond just your own backyard, to go to other faiths. In November, I was with Pope Francis in Bahrain, and the Grand Imam from Al-Azhar was there, and he talked about what Pope Francis has done in terms of interreligious relationships. And he says, what he has done should be an inspiration to the Muslim world to heal our own fractures internally so that we can also then better relate to the Christian world. Again, I just want to emphasize this human fraternity document, which was also then the sort of seeds of Pope Francis's 2021 encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which again, in the middle of COVID, talked about the importance of human fraternity. And I think it's what will be remembered as one of the great documents of this papacy. So this is a photo, again, maybe not as iconic, but it was taken in 2019 at the Vatican Synod on the Amazon. And I captured this photo for 2 reasons. One, Pope Francis has really used synodality as the major vehicle for implementing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. I think for Pope Francis, he saw so much of the spirit of the council had not been instilled in the practices of the institution itself, and especially synodality. So at the end of the council in 1965, Pope Paul VI established synodality as a way in which bishops from around the world could come to Rome every few years to talk about particular issues that are important in the life of the church. And Pope Francis, in a sense, said the structure was there, but it's never really been utilized. There's a joke that's told a lot in Rome that in the synods under Pope John Paul II, that John Paul II would sit there at the front and read his breviary during it, and that he actually wasn't reading his breviary, he was reading the final report that had already been written on the synod. In other words, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. I think it's fair to say that both with Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI, they were afraid to start conversations that they couldn't control. And with Pope Francis, I think he's really sort of taking synodality and inviting it into the practices and the structures of the church, but not just for the bishops, for all the people of God. So now we have this, what began as a 2-year and it was extended into a 3-year consultation process, so that all of the people of God can participate in listening sessions to talk about issues of importance to them at a local level for the church to address worldwide. This, I think, will be considered the major legacy of the Francis papacy, but it is also probably the source of his greatest resistance. And so how this plays out, I'm sure, is something we can talk about a lot over our Q&A in just a bit. But I do think you can't understand the Francis papacy without understanding the way in which he's looked at synodality as the major way of really harnessing the energy of the council and implementing it in the church today. This image was taken on March 27th, 2020. It was in the first month of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was an extraordinarily stormy evening in Rome. Italy was on a severe lockdown. And the Pope went alone in St. Peter's Square, and he gave a brief reflection. And if you go back and reread the reflection, it's not exactly a consolation. I think the Pope is putting himself there with the rest of the world, and he says, why have you abandoned us? The Pope says, we're in the boat, and the seas, like the disciples, but the seas are rocky, and there are storms ahead. And he sort of asks all of us to sort of do an examination of conscience to say, where is God in the world? Where do we find him in the midst of this pandemic? And what sort of different world do we want to create on the other side? And I think it was sort of an examination of conscience for the whole world, but also himself. I think it was in this period where the Pope started thinking about the rest of his papacy and what he wanted to do. And so this is where he began to start writing Fratelli Tutti, the document on human fraternity, because he knew that after COVID, the world would be forever changed, and the only way through it would be together. And this image, I think, just captures so much of who he is, unafraid to sort of stand there alone and try to point in a different direction. This is the first time Pope Benedict came back to the Vatican after his resignation. It was a moment, if you remember that evening on February 28th, where he flew away to Castel Gandolfo. The doors of Castel Gandolfo were shut, and effectively, it was sede vacante. The See of Peter was empty. And so everyone was very curious what this new phase in Catholic Church life would look like once Benedict came back, lived inside the walls of the Vatican. He had vowed to sort of be cloistered and removed from the world. And I think it's fair to say that we don't know. History hasn't really written the final verdict on how those years played out. I think it's fair to say a few things. One, that Pope Francis had tremendous, tremendous respect for Pope Benedict XVI. He often referred to him as a grandfather. I think it's also fair to say that the monastery in which he lived sort of became a hotbed of resistance to the Francis papacy, not so much motivated by Benedict XVI, but around the court around him. And I think very often those sort of that resisted the impulses of the Francis papacy were certainly given refuge by those close to Benedict. And I think this dynamic certainly played out in a number of ways over the 10-year papacy in which Pope Benedict lived inside the Vatican walls. But following his death on December 31st, we've now entered into a new era of the Francis papacy where, in a sense, he is there alone, and it's fully his to do what he wishes with. I think it's certainly fair to say that the Pope has been free for the last 10 years, but we are in a new era in which the Pope is, in every respect, unshackled, and whatever one wants to make of the extent to which Pope Benedict's presence perhaps constrained him, that is no longer in the equation. And it also means that the resistance to Pope Francis has lost their primary figurehead and their primary hub of resistance. And I think that's going to create some very interesting dynamics in the coming years. I want to give you this as the last image. It's the photo of Pope Francis with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and the moderator of the Church of Scotland, Ian Greenshields. This is a photo from a mass, actually this was a prayer service, in Juba in South Sudan. And I think it's incredibly poignant for a number of reasons, that Pope Francis, at 86 years old, was willing to travel into a country that has just been plagued with incredible civil war and violence to effectively beg for peace. And not only did he do so, at 86 years old with a leg that has caused him tremendous pain over the last year, but he did so with his ecumenical brothers. That he said, we can put the differences that have long defined our traditions behind us and together to work for peace. I think it's very much who Pope Francis is. This mindset of what we can do together is what's motivating him. I think he knows the world is rapidly changing, and he's looking for pockets in which he can step in and make a difference. I also put this photo up here because I think at 86 years old, it shows that he's undeterred. He's willing to go into war zones to beg for peace. On the trip back to Rome, on this trip, he said he intends to keep traveling. He wants to go to Mongolia in September. He wants to go to India in 2024, and we'll see what takes us beyond that. At the same time, I think the Pope continues to face incredible resistance, particularly in the U.S. Church, which I think is sort of the hotbed of the Francis resistance. I certainly don't think it's the majority. I think it's actually a small minority of people, but it's a vocal minority, and it's well-funded. But this Pope seems undeterred. He often, in his interviews and in his speeches, he loves to quote literature. And so one of his favorite quotes is from Don Quixote, where he says, "If the dogs are barking, it must mean we're moving ahead." And I think at 86 years old, he is continuing to move ahead, that this Pope, he has taken the message of the gospel, and the messenger has given it serious credibility by his own witness. And so in the same sense that I said, when he appeared on that balcony on March 13th, 2013, that reporters didn't know what awaited them, I think we're still 10 years in at that point. So again, I go back to what I said earlier, buckle up. So. Are we taking a break here? I wanted to save plenty of time for questions and answers because I think that's much more exciting than me just talking at you, and it's much more synodal as well. So,
Where's
Father Greg, what are our instructions?
Are we taking a break? Are we not breaking?
No, okay.
We don't take a break. Okay, I think they want us to move this out of the way. Can we not break it, maybe? Yeah. Okay. But then we're going to block these fine people here, but it's okay. We'll keep moving, I promise. Take you back to your Hollywood. Yeah, tell me.
I think everyone loves for me to look into my crystal ball, and I'll try to do the best that I can, but I often say as a reporter, it's not my job to fix the problems or to predict the future, but just to write about it. So I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. So.
Is there a reason you didn't mention Laudato Si?
Yeah, well, because I didn't have a good photo to go with it. Yeah, I should have stressed at the beginning that the photos were not meant to be comprehensive and cover every element of this papacy. I think, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti are his two big encyclicals. And in many respects, you can't read them apart now, because Fratelli Tutti really relies so heavily on Laudato Si and talks about the way in which everything is connected. It's really remarkable that when Pope Francis in 2014 went to Strasbourg to address the European Parliament, the story goes that he was in his car en route to the speech he was going to give, and he was asked if it was true, if the rumors were true that he was working on a document on the environment, and he said, yes, that is my intention. And he was specifically asked to plan it to be released prior to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And in a sense, I think so many world leaders, when they've gone to the Vatican, have expressed their gratitude to Pope Francis for what he wrote in Laudato Si to really call the world to action on climate change. And many of them have said that the agreements that they reached in Paris in 2015 would not have been possible without Laudato Si being written, and that it certainly pushed people and nudged them along to deepen their commitment. Just last Friday, I believe, Cardinal Czerny, who was the Pope's point man on sort of peace and justice issues, so basically all the problems in the world, he gave a talk about Gonzaga, and our Earthbeat colleague Brian Rohe has a report on NCR Online on this talk. And he said, we're 7 years, 8 years out of Laudato Si, but the challenge is that it doesn't just need to be read and acclaimed, it needs to be practiced. And I think that is very much where things stand today. So.
Father Greg's going to come over with the microphone so everyone can, just quick moment. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Greg. Could you comment about the selection of the cardinal from California? and how that came about?
Well, yes, I should clarify that it's the cardinal from San Diego, not the Archbishop of San Francisco. But he's from here. Nor the Archbishop of Los Angeles. The choice of Cardinal McElroy was in many respects a surprise and not a surprise. I recall that Sunday, I had just gotten in from a bike ride, and I had switched on the Sunday Angelus to pay attention to, and I was listening, and the minute I realized the Pope was creating new cardinals, I immediately got out the recorder and started recording because I knew there'd be work to do. But when he got to number 8, and he said, Robert McElroy of San Diego, I was stunned. Not that he chose him, but that he chose another American. I thought, at this point, the Pope has tried to name fewer Europeans in general, and I think at this point, America is overrepresented in the College of Cardinals. But I think he chose Cardinal McElroy for very obvious reasons, that Cardinal McElroy has been one of his most vocal defenders in this church, really pressing the U.S. church and the U.S. and his brother bishops to sort of take seriously Pope Francis's pastoral direction, and not just to give it lip service. I think in 2019, when Pope Francis invited then Bishop McElroy to be one of the special representatives at the Synod on the Amazon, it was in a sense a signal that the Pope knew who McElroy was and what he had come to represent, and I think he wanted to have a chance to work closely with him for that month in Rome to get to know him a bit better, to understand the way he thinks. And so given that, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that he decided to elevate him. And as we've seen in the last 2 months especially, Cardinal McElroy is anything but afraid, and I think he knows he has the full support of Pope Francis. And even when his brother cardinals label him a heretic, he's not exactly deterred by that. So.
Can you talk about where the money is coming from?
Could you be more specific? Just
Well, you alluded to the fact that there's a great deal of financial support, very wealthy for the conservative or
Yeah.
extreme resistance.
Sure. Well, I would say that first I'm standing on the shoulders of giants in that NCR has done tremendous reporting on following the money for a very long time. And so to the extent that I've reported on that, it's only been building on the work that others at NCR have been doing for well over a decade or 2 decades now. But I would say in this moment in the U.S. Catholic Church, so much of the resistance to Pope Francis comes from the same figures that were very responsible for President Donald Trump's court appointments. So I would say, Leonard Leo, who is the multimillionaire who has bankrolled the Federalist Society, also funds a number of Catholic organizations and entities. I would also say that it's important to look at groups like EWTN. And EWTN is the world's largest Catholic television network. They proudly boast that. And in fact, it's not just one network, EWTN, which is a television network, but they own the National Catholic Register, they own Catholic News Agency, and they get to sort of shape the discussion around so much of this papacy and so much of church life today. And they themselves are very well funded, and it's often by these same individuals. Very much, I would say, folks. The 2 geographic locations I would point to would be Washington D.C. Those that are, Catholic, right-wing Catholics that are very involved in politics in D.C., but also in Denver, Colorado. In the early 90s, when Archbishop Chaput was the Archbishop of Denver, he, in a sense, invited so many startup groups to sort of make Denver their home, and it's attracted a lot of very wealthy conservative Catholics that have sort of, in a sense, fueled some of the resistance to Pope Francis. We can certainly send out all of our detailed reporting. I'm painting in broad brushstrokes here. But if I may, I'll put another plug in for National Catholic Reporter, because we are up against very, very well-funded machines here, and we're trying to do the best we can with our limited resources, but we don't have the resources to compete with networks like EWTN that are outfunded, that outfund us well into the tens of millions of dollars. So.
Hi. Yes. First, Chris, thank you very much for all of your great work. And Joe and Chris, thank you so much for organizing this. And not a plug after what you just said, Chris, but I truly believe NCR's independent voice in the church now is desperately needed. So I think you guys do just great work. The question I have is, I'm a huge fan of Pope Francis. I do not get his policy toward China, especially in light of China coming into Hong Kong and kind of some really problematic, aggressive measures there. Could you unpack that a little bit for us, Chris? Like, what do you think his goal is with his policy toward China in the church there? Thank you.
I think that's a grad level seminar. I'll do the best that I can here. So very briefly, just to provide some context so that we're all on the same page. In 2018, the Vatican entered into an agreement with China. It's an agreement that is it's a private agreement, so the text is not public. And it's, from my understanding and from everything that we know about it, a very narrowly defined agreement specifically and only about the appointment of Catholic bishops in China. So effectively, the state can propose certain bishops and the Vatican can sign off on this. And the reason that the Vatican entered into this agreement was simply for this very real need for there to be bishops in the country. The Vatican's foreign minister, who we have an interview at NCR that just ran on Friday, and the Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, have been very clear that it's an imperfect agreement and that they hope it's a step forward, that it's just the sort of beginnings of better relations with China. That being said, the criticism which I hear from you and I hear often is that by entering into this agreement, it has muzzled the Vatican's ability to speak out against the tremendous religious persecution, not just of Catholics, but with Muslims and Protestants and many others in the country. And I think that is true in many respects. The Vatican has been very reticent about what they will say publicly on China. In fact, there was a moment in 2020 when it sort of was a bit of a scandal because there were prepared texts that went out for the Pope's Sunday Angelus and where he specifically spoke out about the violence in Hong Kong. And so all those covering the Vatican got the prepared text, as we do for his addresses, and then he did not deliver those remarks regarding Hong Kong. And then the prepared remarks, what he had been scripted to say, were then published online. I think the Vatican's just walking a very fine line there. I would say I don't think the Vatican's diplomatic corps is exactly united in where they see this all going and to what position they'd like the Vatican to be taking with China. I think there are those there that would like the Vatican to be taking a much stronger line. But I would also say there's been a reluctance for those, particularly advocates and allies of Pope Francis, as you just identified yourself to be, to criticize the Vatican's stance on China because they don't want to be seen as contributing to the resistance to Pope Francis, because certainly many conservative Catholics have used China as just another sort of arrow in their quiver to attack the Pope. I don't think there's any diplomatic issue that is thornier than the Vatican's approach to China, including Ukraine. I think China is probably the biggest diplomatic challenge facing this papacy. The last thing I will say, and I feel like I've said too much already, but I think it's important to note whether you think it's right or wrong, that the Vatican's approach to China in this moment is actually no different than the same approach Benedict XVI took and John Paul II took. The question is, has China changed too much in this current period for the Vatican to be trying to negotiate with them? And on that question, I'll just say I get to cover it. I don't get to fix those problems as a reporter, so I'm going to plead the fifth there. So,
thank you. First, I want to thank the NCR for all your coverage on the church and its complexity, particularly the resistance. So I want to contribute something to this conversation, and then I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. There's a book that is coming out that will address your question on March 28th, written by one of your parishioners, an award-winning writer, journalist, filmmaker. It is called Playing God, American Catholic Bishops and the Right. In 9 chapters, your parishioner, Mary Jo McConaughey, covers the issue of Pope Francis and the detractors and the resistance, and really ties in so much with your question about how it is well financed and has been financed, and how the roots of this began 50 years ago in terms of the connection with the Catholic Church and evangelicals, and why abortion has been such an issue. So I want to recommend that you pay attention to Playing God by Mary Jo McConaughey, who happens to be sitting right here, too. I find what's in this book is the comprehensive, whereas I get like articles, but this is like the whole picture for now. But now my other question, which you probably would suspect someone would ask here. What are the cracks in terms of women in the church? Thank you.
So I would say 2 things. Pope Francis made headlines in 2017 when he said that he would establish a commission to study the question of women deacons. That's a question that then became very much one of the top issues at the Amazon Synod in 2019, and then he established another commission to study the question of women deacons. It's quite clear to me that the Pope hasn't quite made up his mind on that. Maybe he has personally, but he's trying to work in a way to try to bring unity and move the church along together. But beyond the question of women deacons, which I think has resurfaced throughout the synod process and will certainly be addressed in 2023 and 2024 at the Vatican meetings on the current synod on synodality, I think the common criticism would be that the Pope has certainly moved things forward. He's named women to offices, both religious sisters and lay women, to ranks that they've never previously had at the Vatican, and cleared the way for them to obtain higher leadership positions. But that, in the words of some, that he fails to see women fully as protagonists. And I think it's led to some pretty muddled comments from the Pope when he talks about the role of women. His famous line about women being sort of the strawberries on the icing on the cake. It certainly, causes a lot of people to cringe. And I think he's muddling his way through this, from my experience, covering the Vatican and Rome. There is this sense, I spoke to a very high-ranking woman in the Vatican not so long ago who said that she feels truly honored by her colleagues and taken seriously, and she has a seat at the table and that they listen to her, and that the greatest challenge is not so much that she's a woman, that she's not Italian. And I share that because I think it captures the culture. The culture at the Vatican is very, very difficult to change. It for so long has been a very strict, almost exclusively Italian institution. So imagine then, the Pope hasn't just introduced non-Italians into the equation. He's introduced, religious sisters and laymen and lay women, and that is a very difficult thing to change. On the question of women's ordination, the Pope has repeatedly turned to the words of Pope John Paul II that it's effectively a closed conversation. But that being said, it's pretty remarkable in the 45-page document in larger tent, which is the current continental working document stage of a draft for the Synod, that it raises this question. This is a text produced by the Vatican that specifically puts women's ordination as a question for consideration. It is very clear that the document is not church teaching, but it allows for conversation. And I think for many people, that in itself is a sign that change still is possible. So I think most people would give him a very incomplete mark on this. But yeah, there you have it.
I think one of the things, at least the way it's been explained to me too, is we kind of expect change to happen at the speed of America, right? So iPhone 15 is going to be much better than iPhone 14, which was much better than iPhone 13. And when it comes to the church, we expect the same. But American Catholics make up 6% of the global church. So I think for someone in the shoes of the fisherman, in Pope Francis' shoes, he has to understand how far he can push on especially those kinds of issues and be accepted by the global church. And so I think what we see as small steps or even a little dance forward and then back is his, I think, trying to find the right path, the sort of middle path to a route that it might actually be effective, as opposed to just declaring something and creating more problems than perhaps he solves.
I'll say one more thing, if I may. In July, I went down to Nairobi to cover a big conference of African theologians. And it was a terrific week and a chance to shine a spotlight on voices that are too often marginalized and are just not heard at all in the church. And I was particularly curious about the question of the role of women, because often you hear that the resistance for, say, women deacons comes from the global south. And one religious sister, who's also a theologian, said to me, it's not so much that we're hesitant or resistant to it, it's just we have other ranking issues, such as clean drinking water. And it was, I think it illustrated what Joe just said, for many U.S. Catholics, this is a front burner issue. The Pope is trying to listen to those in Nairobi as much as he is, to those here in San Francisco, and that's quite a challenge. Hi, Annette.
Hi. Chris, your predecessor, Josh McElwee, earlier this week shared a personal, memorable experience exchange that he had with the Pope. Do you have one?
No, 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 no. Thank you for asking.
I mean, like Josh, so we're very fortunate. One of the reasons why I would encourage you to support NCR is because we get to travel with the Pope and have a front row seat to his events and to cover these events, and including being on the papal plane with him. And we always cherish the moments in which we're traveling to a particular country where we get to have a private moment with him. And so most of those encounters I'm reluctant to share. I will say this because it's fun. In this last trip down to South Sudan, or to Congo actually, I was chatting with him and I said, next month is 10 years, congratulations. A lot of Americans didn't want you to reach this point. And he roared with laughter. And I think, one of the things that, if you can get the Pope to laugh, it's one of the best ways to get him to engage. Let's not forget the first document that he produced was called The Joy of the Gospel. And so if you can show that you've got joy, it's a way to evoke the Pope's own joy. And so I think, he loves a bit of self-deprecating humor. So.
Hi. What is your understanding of the Church's position when the Catholic priests have denied the Eucharist to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and others?
Yeah. Well, the microphone picked up your sigh there at the end. I think it's a distinctly American phenomenon. I think you can look, there's no other bishops' conference in the world that has ever even had this debate. It's a consequence, I think, of the U.S. Bishops becoming especially polarized, and where partisan politics has really driven their approach to pastoral life. I think Pope Francis, he's very cautious not to wade in too much and insert himself into the debates of a particular country. But I think he said it, where he pretty clearly when he said, "I've never denied the Eucharist to anyone." And when he's talking about the Eucharist, you often hear him say "tutti, tutti, tutti." They all, or everyone, ever. And so, I think it's the Vatican before the U.S. bishops in 2021 had their debate over this, sent the sort of strongest warnings that they diplomatically could to avoid going down this road. I think many U.S. bishops really wanted a fight, and it's a fight that they are not getting support from in Rome. So you have certain rogue archbishops or bishops that will do their own thing, but that is a position that I think puts them out of step with Pope Francis and the Holy See more broadly.
You say you've talked several times about the recalcitrance of the U.S. Conference of Bishops. Could you talk a little bit about the history in terms of how we got here and what the short-term and mid-term future of the constellation of bishops in this country might look like?
Sure. That's again another grad level seminar question. I mean, yes. I mean, it's quite remarkable that once upon a time the U.S. bishops were a tremendous force in political and social life in the United States, publishing very serious documents about the economy and Catholic social teaching that really were taken seriously by not just the church but the world around it. I think in one of the things that Pope John Paul II really did was emphasize the importance of the hierarchy. And so I think what he did throughout his nearly 30-year papacy is to remake the U.S. episcopacy. And he spent a tremendous amount of energy on trying to identify and name archbishops in the United States and elsewhere that shared his pastoral agenda and that would fall in line. And he relied on them to then suggest others to be named bishops. So after 30 years, you can do a real makeover of any institution And I think he successfully did that in the U.S. church. At the same time, I'd say in the 90s into the 2000s, you saw a real shift at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C., where most of their staff members were not people that really were well-versed in theology or in church life, but were much more comfortable working, say, for the Republican National Committee. And that's sort of and just lobbyists in general. And I think that's sort of the pool that they've recruited from and that they're most comfortable with even to this day. So come 2013, when you have a pope who's elected from the global south, who says very radical things about the market economy, who is much more interested in talking about migration and ecology and poverty than he is talking about sex and family life issues. It unsettled a lot of U.S. bishops, and it unsettled a lot of traditional church groups that kind of had gotten used to, under Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, having a pope that they were in lockstep with. And when the Pope said, we're going to go in a different direction, they've, in many respects, I think, failed to catch up.
Your response to the question about women in the church led to a response about how slow the institution of the church globally is to respond, and yet how quick things move in America. And it's in my darker times of looking at the current church, I very much worry about its ability to keep pace. And it's not just the American church, I think it's the Western world. And anecdotally, I myself, and probably many people here, I'm the grandson of 4 European immigrants, where Catholic faith was absolutely crucial to existence, and my parents' generation, the World War II generation as well. And in my lifetime, throughout my entire family, extended family, I don't think I've been to a Catholic wedding of, the 30-year-olds and such. 5 of 6 of my nephews and nieces, did not have Catholic ceremonies in their weddings. And when we think about the big issues that were mentioned at church of, women in the church, LGBTQ issues, divorce, so on and so forth, in my dark moments, it's like, how do we not completely lose Christianity in the Western world in the next, from now, the next 30 years, whatever? I mean, it seems absolutely crucial to me that this institution somehow respond, even though I get it about the worldwide institution and how hard it is to change. Any comments?
Let me start.
Yes, Joe, I'm passing this off to Joe.
It's not over yet, is all I could say. It's, and I'll just say something that we see, and I've talked about this before. There's clearly a cohort of young Catholics who we refer to as Francis Catholics, who are energized by what he has to say about welcoming LGBTQ Catholics, about the environment, about migration, et cetera, et cetera. You would call them Vatican II Catholics, right? But that's not their point of reference. Their point of reference is Francis. So that's what they think of. They may not have been paying attention to the church for a while, but then this guy comes along and they go, oh, because they don't know the Vatican II church, right? This time it's like, I haven't seen this before. And the way I know it, and here's another NCR plug coming, so forgive me, we have about 1 million users a month visiting our website. And of those million, about half, a little less, are 44 years old or younger. About 30% are 34 years old or younger. Because we cover women's issues, we talk about LGBTQ Catholics, we talk about where the money goes in the church, and we talk about things like the environment. And I think that is drawing some young Catholics. Now, the flip side of that is, and I think what we worry about, is if nothing happens over the next couple of years, right? If the synodality process doesn't lead to some sort of accommodation to modernity, do those young Catholics who've now said, oh, I'm interested, I'm paying attention, tell me what you got, if they see nothing, they're probably then gone. But there is a moment here where I think the church has a chance to keep these folks energized and to keep them paying attention. Oops. But by the way, I agree with you. I can't remember the last wedding I went to either of someone, in their 30s and late 20s that was a Catholic wedding. I agree.
I'll just say two things very briefly, and to just sort of add to what Joe said, because I agree with exactly everything he said. But he signs my paychecks. No, the Pope, I think, understands very clearly that these systems are really collapsing, and that something new has to emerge. And I think he's doing the best he can, and so that is why this, synodality is at the center of his papacy, because he knows that the only way to invite the entire world to sort of participate in this is if the church is actually willing to be much more humbler, and willing to listen. So I think he understands that. Now, will these things happen quickly enough? That remains to be seen. But I do think that is very much why he's, in a sense, fast-tracked the synod, and he's having bishops' conference in the world, do a heck of a lot of work to sort of get on board with him and share in this process, because he realizes that, we have to act quickly. I will say one other thing. I lived in New York for about 16 years before I moved to Rome. And you want to talk about a buzzkill at a bar, tell them that tell someone you cover the Catholic Church. That changed with Pope Francis. And everyone has something to say, and they're interested in this Pope. And they have opinions, and even if they're not Catholic, they're peripherally following what he's up to. And now it's the easiest conversation starter you could imagine. So I think there is something to it, and it goes back to the point I made as I was concluding the initial remarks, is that the message has been given serious credibility by its messenger. And I think young people crave authenticity. And when you've got a credible messenger like Pope Francis, it does change hearts and minds. Well,
he doesn't like you anymore. That's why. I had dinner with him. Heidi Schlumpf, our editor, and I had dinner with Tom down at the Religious Education Conference in Anaheim about 2 weekends ago, and he specifically said he doesn't like you people. No, honestly though, he's great. He is going to spend the summer, I think, down at Loyola Marymount University down in Los Angeles. So he'll be in California, and maybe he'll come back. But he's all good.
I'll also say that tomorrow on NCR we have a piece running on all of the Jesuits of the Pope Francis papacy, and it's been a tremendous season for Jesuits in the life of the church over the last 10 years. So it's a piece that I have looking at that, and if you go on NCR tomorrow, you can read it, and you will recognize a certain Father Tom Reese who weighs in on that. So I won't spoil what he says, but stay tuned.
And I'll say it's always a terrific season for Jesuits. It's always a terrific season for Jesuits. I'll say that.
That must be why we have so many of them. I just want to follow up on something previously said. We were talking about the Bishops' Conference and the challenges of the Bishops' Conference. I was in Seattle during the time that Archbishop Hunthausen was given an auxiliary, when Bishop Wuerl was sent there. And John Paul was not hesitant to use techniques to insert himself into the politics of the bishops in the United States. And the bishops you spoke about in terms of the peace pastoral and other pastorals were in some ways undermined by the papacy in that time. but I think Francis doesn't want to use those techniques. Is there a way, is the Synod the way in which the Pope is hoping that the voice of the faithful, who are not well represented by the Bishops' Conference, I think the Synod has already shown that the agenda of the faithful is not the agenda of the bishops of the United States. Is the Synod a way that somehow we will be able to reform the Bishops' Conference in the United States, or is there any way in which it seems that the Pope doesn't want to insert himself into it?
To quote from a certain Father Tom Reese, Francis actually believes in conversion. This is something Tom said recently, that the Pope believes in conversion, but as a sociologist, I have a much more difficult time with that. But it does get at why he's been very reluctant to sort of yank the chain on bishops that aren't on board with his agenda. You referenced Archbishop Hunthausen, so I'll share with you something that came to mind is that, when the Archbishop was investigated and sent an auxiliary to basically curtail his powers, it was because he was speaking out on issues such as the role of women and LGBTQ issues. And today, thanks to synodality, the very issues that he was silenced for are open conversations in the life of the church. So I do think that's very much the mechanism in which the Pope is trying to address these neuralgic issues and to bring everyone on board with. Is it perfect? Is it working? No, I think it's uneven, but I think, just 2 weeks ago, I was in a Vatican office. I had gone in to interview Cardinal Roach, who's the head of the Vatican's worship office. And I was stunned. We're doing an interview in his office, and we're sitting across from each other, and there's a coffee table in between us, and that coffee table has a stack of booklets on it. And those booklets that that were there for the taking were the Synod document that I recommended to you. The Synod document that in it talks about the need for the church to change on LGBTQ issues, the role of women. And I thought, how remarkable that this document, inviting and encouraging a conversation and calling for change, is there in the presence of a Vatican cardinal in his office, where not so long ago, these offices were there to silence those who said the very things that are now in the document. So I do think that's part of what Pope Francis is trying to do. I mentioned earlier that the Pope. That Pope John Paul II had really relied on the hierarchy to get his agenda done, to sort of do his bidding. And I think Pope Francis has redirected his attention and his energy to the synodal process. And because that's not as authoritarian, I think it's harder to see the fruits of that right away. I think Jesus says that underscores everything that Pope Francis does. I think it's in every single document. That's the starting point. I don't think one has to recite the full Gospels to understand that is the very motivating factor. I think his papacy is a very Christological papacy. I think it's very hard to imagine someone who is as representative as Christ in the 21st century as Pope Francis, someone who is willing to go into war zones, who's willing to hug those, such as the image I showed there, who's willing to talk to those that have traditionally been shunned. And I think he's doing all of that because he's someone who is radically transformed by the life of Christ, and he's inviting others to do the same.
Hi. I wanted to just really impressed with the way you started this journey of your own journalism and trying to see the representation of the Pope and that authenticity with his values and his priorities. And as you can tell from this conversation, one of the 10 pictures were representing women. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, if you had 20 more slides to show us today, are there other images? I'm compelled to go home and just Google Pope and women and see what comes up in the Google feed, because this is the part that makes it difficult. I'm raising two adult young women, and they're looking for representations. They're looking for images that can crystallize that new Catholicism that I think we're all hungering for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here. I hope, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to serve as an apologist for the papacy. I think one of the things, it's a tremendous thing to tune into a Vatican event where the cardinals are meeting, such as the Pope's end-of-year Christmas address, where he meets with the whole Curia. And, it's a room that looks like a boys' club. And that's a difficult image, and I understand it personally. I understand it, because it's just an image that doesn't reflect the world around us. So I think that remains perhaps the biggest hurdle. I think if you look at the Synod document that I mentioned, 45 pages, the strongest passages in the longest section is on women. And why is that? It's because that document is a synthesis document from the voice of the people, from the ground up. So that sort of cry is there. So if you go home and Google that, I'm sorry to say that you're not going to have great results. I think you'll get images of, say, Sister Nathalie Becard, who's the French nun who is the #2 at the Vatican Synod office. You'll get photos of Emile Secuda, the Argentine who runs the Pontifical Commission on Latin America. You'll get photos of, various women. But it's something, Pope Francis said when we were coming back from Bahrain, he said, every time I've named a woman in a position of authority, things improve inside the Vatican. I think so he recognizes that, but there still is a real gap between the decisions he's taken and to the extent he is constrained by the structures including the sort of norms and laws that have traditionally existed, and he's slowly trying to dismantle them, but it is a very cumbersome process. So, yeah.
Chris, I have two questions
Sure.
about the Pope. First is, you read a lot about his retirement, number one. Number two, about his health. But he seems to have a lot more positive energy lately. He's graduated to a cane. So can you, not going into it personally, but just more or less you read about it, and you then a big question mark, hopefully, this other side's not pushing it too far.
Yes, this is the question that consumes reporters, how is the Pope doing? And it's consumed us since really last February when the Pope had to cancel a day trip up to Florence. And it was the first time where he said, due to knee trouble, I'm not going to be able to fulfill an obligation. And then we saw him later in the spring using a wheelchair quite often. And I want to say, on one hand, it was remarkable to see him unafraid to do that, to show that he, had limitations. More recently, we see him using a cane. And I think part of, what we can say is that the Pope is improving in terms of his mobility. I think we'll see him use a cane for the rest of this pontificate. I don't think we'll see him without that. But I'm going to use his lines to tell you what he thinks of the situation, which is that it takes a head to govern, not legs. And I think that's very much his mindset, that, unless he's otherwise, encumbered, he's not going to let this slow him down. And so, is he more fatigued from travels? Yes. But is he willing to do what I think is going to be a 16-hour flight to Mongolia? Yes, he's willing to do that. So he's pressing ahead. It's 10 years on, and just last year, the Vatican had its new constitution that came out about, reforming the Curia. So it's amazing that 10 years in, we've seen so much, but just now, he has his own constitution and he has his own government in place, so he can begin to implement more of the changes that he'd like to see. And I think he likes that, and he doesn't want to slow down if he can. So I think, this is someone who has said, if I need to resign, I will, but I don't think we'll see that anytime soon.
Hi. The photo that you chose of Pope Francis speaking to Congress reminded me of a very remarkable moment where the Pope had a private conversation with John Boehner, and a couple days later he resigned. And so do you have any idea what was said or spoken about during that meeting, or if it led to the resignation?
I don't think so. I think actually about a year or so ago, I interviewed Speaker Boehner when his memoir came out, specifically about the role that Catholicism had played in his public life and culminating in the visit of Pope Francis. And in a sense, he stole some of the Pope's headlines because the Pope left Washington to go up to New York and then on to Philadelphia, and his visit continued. But some of the headlines were immediately switched to about Boehner's resignation. I think, look, the Pope in these encounters and what Boehner says in his memoir and in the interview was that, the Pope just prayed with him. It was not an extensive conversation about his political career, his political future. I think if we look back on those images of Boehner standing on the balcony of the Capitol and he's just a puddle from all the tears, he was deeply moved by the Pope. I can't help but think that the Pope's visit sort of put into perspective what the role of Catholics in public life should be, but how that affected his decision, I don't know. So, I mean, the other example I'll give, more close to home, since we're here in San Francisco, is Speaker Pelosi. Last October, when she met with Pope Francis at the Vatican, October 21. You watch the video footage of when she enters the room, and she's very moved by the encounter, and she had met the Pope a number of times. But I think it's got to be something for these, lifelong Catholics who, have this Pope, who is willing to sort of just talk with them and walk alongside them without a real sort of need to, lecture them on what they should or shouldn't be doing. It's got to be pretty affecting. So.
Hi, thanks for coming. Comments earlier about the lack of young people in the church in the U.S. Are not practicing their faith. But parts of the world the church is growing, like Africa and whatnot. So based on your reporting, what do you see as attractive in those parts of the world about Catholic Church in general or the Francis papacy in particular?
Yeah. I'll tell you, when Pope Francis arrived in Kinshasa, in the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, on January 31st of this year, it was one of the most incredible things I've ever witnessed, because from the airport all the way to the center of town, it was about 15 miles, just rows and rows and rows of people the entire way, many, many lines deep, holding up posters, shouting, dancing, screaming, singing, you name it. And that was in a country that is about 80% under the age of 30 and is overwhelmingly Catholic. And then you saw it the next day at the Papal Mass with over 1 million people. Again, the overwhelming number of people there under the age of 30. So I think, that is where the church is most alive. What do I see as attractive? Despite the general conservatism that you see from the global South, that's true, but it's not a Catholicism that is dominated by the culture wars. It's dominated by a church that understands what it means to stand alongside its people who are suffering in the trenches. And so I think they're given a daily reminder of the essential role the church plays in their life. And I think that is probably where they experience what Pope Francis would say, the joy of the gospel. Those images are some of the images that will forever stick with me of what this papacy means to people. And I think that's where we see the church at its best as well. I couldn't help but think when we were down there in Congo and also in South Sudan, where several scenes played out just similar to that, that it had to be such a palate cleanser for Pope Francis leaving the Vatican, where all these old cardinals are sniping at one another and gossiping, and he breaks free from the Vatican and he's able to go and see the church alive, joyful, and that's why he wants to go and be with people.
Is there a reason there hasn't been more coverage of the murder of the bishop in the United States?
Well, I think you're referring to Bishop David O'Connell, the auxiliary down in Los Angeles, I presume. I think, I don't know what the media coverage here has been like. I know we certainly covered it fully at NCR and ran a number of tributes. My understanding is that it was fairly well covered in the U.S. I know in the Vatican it was on, covered by the Vatican's daily newspaper, Pope Francis in a special telegram. I want to plead a bit of ignorance here, just as someone who lives outside of the country. So I'll let Joe say a bit more.
We've covered it a bit, not as much as the papers in Los Angeles. We're not crime reporters, as much as that gets a lot of traction on the web. It'd be great if we were. And I used to work at Dateline, so I know it's great. But it has been covered. I think if you haven't heard a lot about it lately, it's entered that odd period where the investigators are doing their work. So there's just not a lot of news coming out of it. Things are happening, I'm sure. It's a murder investigation. There's someone been charged, obviously, and now prosecutors and detectives are trying to put together a case. So that may take a while, but I think that's where it's at right now. And I would hope that's the crack crime reporters at the LA Times would maybe get something going and trying to get some information about it. But it's entered that phase, so that's why I think it's gone quiet.
Time for a couple more questions. All right, we got 2, 3. Last 3.
To begin by echoing my gratitude to be here, thank you. The Latin Mass seems to be alive and well in this archdiocese, and I'm just wondering, if you can help us understand, are we moving anywhere? I know there was something recently, but can you just let us know what's happening with that issue?
I think the most important thing to say is Pope Francis sees the great necessity being reception of the Second Vatican Council. I think that's one of the chief goals of his papacy. And so one of the reasons in which Pope Francis has, to use the language of some, crackdown on the traditional Latin Mass, and I think it's important to say the traditional Latin Mass because you can celebrate the Mass in Latin anywhere you want. It's the traditional Latin Mass, which has a very different ecclesiology of the Mass that emerged after the Council. And so I think that's why we've seen this Pope spend a lot of his energy being willing to take on traditionalists because he sees that as sort of pockets of resistance to it's not so much just about liturgy, but about the Council. So where do things stand? Well, if you want to have a traditional Latin Mass take place in a particular diocese, it has to be at a church that is not used as a parish, and it has to be as a parish church, and it has to get special clearances from Rome. So I think, there's been serious scrutiny that the Vatican's worship office is wanting to sort of, apply to this, because again, the line for Pope Francis is that this is about continuity with the Council. It's not just about the liturgy. And I would just say you note that it's alive and flourishing in this archdiocese. Yes, there's certainly huge pockets here and there where it's popular, but overwhelmingly, I'd say the Latin Mass, traditional Latin Mass observants are a very, very overall tiny minority, and the numbers bear that out in this country and elsewhere. So I think it is certainly an issue, but it only affects a very tiny percentage of Catholics.
I have a question. Looking forward, assuming Francis passes on, has he instituted enough changes in the church to avoid the second coming of John Paul II or people like that?
Well, from a pure numbers perspective, the Pope has now appointed 2/3 of the cardinals who will vote, for the next successor of Peter. Now, the challenge is, he's identified cardinals in faraway places, often because he's impressed by their pastoral service. So, for the first time in history, there are cardinals in places like East Timor and Tonga and Burundi and places that, have not traditionally had cardinals. And so we don't know a lot of a lot about some of these guys. And equally critical is they don't know a lot about one another. So the pre-conclave meetings, whenever that time comes, those, a week or so of meetings will be a very critical time so that, it's the first time many of them will be in a room together, or one of the first times they'll be in a room together. So Yes, it's undeniable from a numbers perspective that he's appointed the number of guys that will vote to elect the next pope. Do they all share his pastoral agenda fully? I think that's a much more difficult question to answer. I would not, take it to the bank that the next pope is going to be very much in the mold of Francis. I think it's more likely than not. But Pope Francis was a surprise in 2013, so that does not preclude another surprise when the next pope is elected.
So you're a correspondent in Europe, so I want to ask about the war in Europe and what you're seeing in Rome. This morning, I think it was on NPR, they did the Francis at 10 retrospective, and one of the comments that was made was that there's some feeling that he missed a real great opportunity in maybe going too far to preserve the Vatican's neutrality and trying to have good offices to both places. But in Ukraine, we've got a very significant war going on. What are you seeing in Rome? And then also, even more specifically to the geopolitics of it, but you talked earlier about the ecumenism that so much of his papacy has been. What about the Russian Orthodox Church and the other orthodoxies?
I'll try to answer every thread of that. It's a lot. I think to begin with, it's fair to say, and this isn't my judgment, this is the words of the Vatican's foreign minister, who put it this way to me in an interview that we published on Friday, is that the Pope's understanding of the war in Ukraine has evolved over time as the war itself has evolved. So it took Pope Francis quite some time to, one, directly name Russia as the aggressor in the war. And I think a large part of that was because I think when the war first started, the Vatican did see itself as perhaps actually being able to play a much more hands-on role in mediating a peace. This war has gone on, I think, a lot longer than Pope Francis imagined it to, that it would have. And what we've seen in that time is an escalation in the way he's spoken about the war, where he's no longer been as hesitant to point the finger directly at Russia and Putin directly. You talk about the Vatican's sort of what they call positive neutrality, and sort of the language is we may be neutral, but we're not indifferent, is what they often say at the Vatican Secretary of State. And so, who do they see at fault in this war? Certainly they see as Russia as the aggressor and at fault. I think the thing Pope Francis is trying to do, I think part of this, you mentioned the geopolitics of this, the Pope is the first Pope from the global South. I think he's a lot more uncomfortable with Western alliances than, say, Pope Benedict XVI or Pope John Paul II. And so, I don't think he wants to be perceived as, say, the chaplain to NATO. And so I think he's trying to see, that's part of the world order, but not the world order, in the words of Archbishop Gallagher, the Vatican's foreign minister. So he's trying to preserve a special space for the role of the Pope. It's incredibly difficult. I would say, next to China, Ukraine is definitely the thorniest diplomatic engagement this papacy is faced. I was able to be in Ukraine for a week in this past December, and I was there with a delegation of journalists that cover the Vatican, and we interviewed the foreign minister, and they said they appreciated the Pope's evolving understanding of the war in Ukraine, and going forward, what they don't want him to do is appeal to Russia and appeal to Ukraine for peace in the same breath, because that appears to level the playing field of responsibility. And they said they believe over time the Pope has understood the consequences of that. They're still very frustrated that the Pope is unwilling to go to Kyiv without also going to Moscow, but the Pope seems unwilling to be moved by that. So I think he believes that he has to preserve a certain level of distance, and that is the necessary role of Peter in all of this, and that's why it's been a very difficult thing for both Ukrainians and those on the outside to make sense of. Just finally, to answer your question on the Russian Orthodox Church, in 2016, Pope Francis met with Patriarch Kirill in Havana. They signed a declaration together. It was kind of considered a new spring in Orthodox Catholic relations. I think it's fair to say that all of the goodwill that was built up in that time has been, completely
sort of evaporated because of, to use the words of Pope Francis, Patriarch Kirill serving as the altar boy of Putin. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we want to keep you longer. I just want to wrap up and then give it to Father Greg by doing the most Catholic thing I can think of, which is to ask you for money. Thank you. If you Google NCR, every once in a while the first response that comes up is the National Cash Register Company. That's not us. That's not us. We are independent journalistically, but we are also independent financially. We don't get any support from any religious group, religious order, from anyone in the church hierarchy, which is why Chris can say the things he says and be okay. But we need your help. As we said, and as we've been talking about, the next couple of years are going to be very important in the life of the church. I think it is the duty of each Catholic to be informed. I think attention must be paid about what's going to happen over the next 2 years. That's our job at NCR, is to try to bring you best we can what's really going on so that you can decide for yourselves what should be going on. But we do need your help. So our dear colleague Lori will be standing outside with these lovely blue envelopes. In it is a lot of information about NCR and ways you can help. If you are already a donor, there's info about ways you can help more, which would also be great. If you don't help us, that's okay, but expect a long, long battle with Catholic guilt when you get home. Okay? Remember, the donuts weren't free. They never are. But seriously, the other thing you could do is to read us, to subscribe, to go online and just read us, because if you don't read us, everything we do is just dumb. And we really do need to pay attention. A lot of Catholics, especially folks more casual than those of us in the room, think that they don't need to pay attention, that, well, those guys don't speak for me, therefore I don't need to listen to them. But then suddenly they turn around one day and we have a conservative Catholic Supreme Court and they don't know how it happened. And they don't know why decisions are getting made that are so incredibly unpopular. So we all owe it to ourselves to pay attention and to stay informed. And that's our mission, and we hope you can help us with that. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time and your questions, your patience. We're very, very grateful that you're here. Chris and Joe, thank you very much. Thank you for helping us to pay attention and give deep depth and insight to our lives as Catholics in this contemporary church. Very grateful for your time. Thank you for your making time for us in your schedules and being here with us. We wish you all God's best. Thank you. Thank you for being here.